Well, welcome, friends. We are so glad to have you all here. And we'll be recording this presentation for the folks that have registered, so we can send it to them if they aren't able to be here tonight. I am Elizabeth Reese, and I'm one of the clergy from St. Paul's Episcopal Church. And we're very glad to gather with folks from St. Paul's community, but also from other Alexandria churches and community members as well. It's very good to be together. And I think it makes our voices and our actions and our prayers stronger that we can gather here as a group tonight. So many of us, the background of this gathering, many of us were part of the Episcopal Church's Sacred Ground curriculum. And if you're not familiar with that, it's a 10-week program of really deeply studying racism in the United States and digging into and reflecting on sort of our part in that history and in our own sort of family part in that, but also thinking about kind of what it looks like and what we might be called to do about it. So after going through that, many of us decided we wanted to keep learning, keep studying. And so tonight is the second part of a 4-part series that is our continued effort to keep exploring, keep digging deeper into systemic racial injustice in our own city here in Alexandria. So last month, we got a glimpse of how racism affects health, and tonight we'll be focusing on housing. And as I said last month, that the ground is really enormous. It's a little overwhelming sometimes, and in some ways, I think we're continuously shown how little we're moving in this, how slow going this process is, and there's a long way down this path still to go. But who knows where this will lead us, this exploration and this gathering together. So tonight, we will begin by grounding ourselves in prayer and in scripture. And I'm very thankful for the Reverend Martha Horn, who will be leading us in prayer. Thank you, Martha.
Thank you. This COVID year has caused me to think in many new ways about housing. So I'm grateful for this opportunity and tonight to hear. So thank you to those of you who will be with us and help us. It was this time last year, just about exactly this time in the middle of March, when my husband and I returned from a visit with family members who live about 100 miles north of Seattle. The coronavirus was racing through a nursing home in Seattle then, and had begun to show up in cities and towns throughout the country, including here in Alexandria. The trip home involved 3 airports, a 6-hour flight, and a midnight Uber home from the airport in the days before people were told that we should be wearing masks. Excuse me. I remember what a relief it was to get home that night, to be able to close the door and finally to feel safe in a space that was our own. Safe housing should be a basic human right, but too often it's an elusive dream for many who find themselves homeless or living in temporary conditions. And certainly this year for so many people through COVID who have lost their jobs and also their homes. And unfortunately in Alexandria, as in so many other places, systemic racism has led to discriminatory policies and practices that have made it especially difficult for people of color to find safe and affordable housing. One of the most poignant verses of scripture appears in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, when Jesus reminds his disciples that foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Not only was Jesus born in a temporary shelter, but he also lived much of his life as an itinerant preacher and teacher with no permanent place to lay his head. Shane Claiborne is a Christian community activist and an advocate for the poor and the disenfranchised, and he likes to ask us this question: how can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday? Like the prophets of Israel before him, Jesus calls us to be advocates for those who bear the brunt of unfair and prejudicial policies. So my prayer tonight is that what we hear and learn will give us the wisdom and the will to work for fair and equitable housing for all our brothers and sisters here in Alexandria. And I pray that God will grant us both the strength and the courage for the work we're called to do. Amen.
And now I'm bringing up Alice, who I'm so thankful. She's been arranging this behind the scenes for quite a while. So many thanks, Alice.
It's my pleasure. Tonight, we're going to be hearing about and talking about how systemic racism in Alexandria has shaped and restricted housing availability for Blacks in the 20th century and beyond. We'll also learn more about recent efforts to level the housing availability playing field for people of color in a city where housing is buffeted by many forces, some old, some new. Our first speaker will be Kristin Moon. Kristin Moon is a professor of history at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, where she has directed the American Studies program for more than a decade. Her teaching and research has ranged widely, covering such topics as U.S. immigration history, popular culture, race and ethnic studies. Sorry. She's also written a variety of books and articles concerning immigration and ethnic identity. Professor Moon lives in Alexandria. She has worked with the Office of Historic Alexandria, researching race and ethnicity and housing patterns in the city. And she is also a past president of the Alexandria Historical Society. Welcome, Kristin.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to share my screen, so just give me a moment to get it all set up for everybody. Thank you so much for that introduction. As Alice noted, I'll be talking about the history of housing and its impact on African-American residents historically. This is part of some research that I have published, but also continuing to grapple with, which in these interesting times, it is definitely harder to do archival and library work, but nevertheless, we persist. So before we really get in deep in terms of looking at housing accessibility and the history of it here in the city of Alexandria, I want to talk broadly about context. There are three overlapping forces that really come into play in terms of the establishment of structural racism and its relationship with housing in the city. The first one that I want to talk about is progressivism. Now, most people, when you hear progressivism, you think of people having politics of left of center. But in fact, when we're talking about the late 19th and the early 20th century, we are actually talking about a political philosophy in which increasing numbers of Americans are turning to the government, whether local, state, or federal, to address social problems. And again, those social problems can be seen as to the left politically or the right, whether we're talking about child labor laws or eugenical-based immigration practices. But what the key part is looking to government to deal with social issues. In addition, we have the emergence of what we call we'll get to that in a second, scientific management. Scientific management is basically taking some of the ideas of the factory floor and applying it to the human condition. But to do that requires experts who study everyday life and best practices, and then try to apply it to people's communities. These, of course, are your social workers, your city planners. These are new types of occupations that emerge in this period. And finally, is evolutionary racism. This is a concept that emerges out of Charles Darwin's Origins of Species, and with evolutionary racism, we see the creation of a hierarchy based upon notions of biological fact. These three categories and ideas of looking at the world inform what will become de jure residential segregation. Now, de jure means by law. What you see in front of you right now is not. This is de facto. When we talk about de facto and de jure, we're talking about segregation by custom and segregation by law. What you see is a map created using the 1900 US Census. And again, a shout out for Ben Skolnick and Cam Gibson for collecting this data and creating these GIS maps that show you that even before the passage of laws that would impact where African Americans can live in the city, that we already see segregation going on. Now, what is interesting about the segregation in front of you right now is that in many ways, it is tied to a very long history of free African American land ownership, starting in the 1790s and the early 1800s, particularly in the areas to your bottom of the screen, the Bottoms and Hayti. During and after the Civil War, we see the emergence of new neighborhoods, Uptown and the Burg. You probably know Uptown, by the way, as Parker Gray today. These particular ones in the North would expand exponentially throughout the mid to late 20th century. Now, why or what is going on that would facilitate shifting from what is clearly already a segregationist practice to the start of passing legislation on the local, state, and federal level to make sure that the lines between where people lived become even more severe? And part of that is, again, tied to the racial attitudes of the time, but more importantly, it's also people's anxieties and fears about the success of African Americans 1 to 2 generations out from the American Civil War, who are embracing education and upward mobility and becoming part of the professional class, and of course, gathering wealth. As such, one of the first tools used to restrict where African Americans live are what are known as restrictive covenants. Now, restrictive covenants are language put into deeds that dictate who can or who cannot live in a particular place. Now, this deed in front of you is actually from what is now Fort Ward Park and Museum. It was a development that was going to be called Eagle Crest that was never developed. And instead, the area actually became the park, which we all know today. If you notice the highlighted section in the middle here, it says that this property can only be owned or occupied by a person of the Caucasian race, and that it's also perpetual, so for time immemorial. What is significant about this, and this is something very uniquely Virginia, is this idea of not just targeting African Americans, but actually creating a white, non-white divide. And that we see this repeatedly in the state of Virginia because Virginia, by the 1920s, has some of the strictest one-drop rules in the country. And so this type of language is in many ways unique to Virginia. In other parts of the country, you would see very different language where they would delineate which populations could not live in a location. So for example, at the bottom here, you notice I wrote Shelley versus Kramer. That is the US Supreme Court case that deemed restrictive covenants to be unconstitutional. That involved restrictive covenants affecting Chinese immigrants and African Americans in the city of St. Louis. If we were talking about Washington, D.C., you would find restrictive covenants also affecting African Americans, but also Jews and Syrians. It depends on the local racial and ethnic politics, what groups would be affected by these types of laws. In addition to restrictive covenants, we also need to deal with state ordinances that sort of tumble into city ordinances. Of particular import here in Virginia is the passage of the Virginia Segregation District legislation in 1912. This allowed municipalities, so cities, not counties, to create segregation districts where African Americans could live and white residents could live. The process was basically a city council would propose creating these segregation districts, would generate a map, and the map would be approved by the community. We know of at least 4 cities here in Alexandria, or here in Virginia, that pursued this legislation. The closest to us here was actually Falls Church. Falls Church established a segregation district in 1915. This was seen as so problematic that it quickly, of course, ended up in the US Supreme Court and was deemed unconstitutional in Buchanan versus Worley. It should be noted, this case actually involved Louisville, Kentucky, and particularly it was an issue about private property, that in fact these segregation districts were so rigid that it impacted both white and African American property owners writ large. Finally, we have the establishment of zoning. Virginia doesn't allow for zoning until 1922. And Alexandria, it's interesting, doesn't actually pursue zoning right away. There's actual pressure coming from another entity, the federal government. The federal government is what dictates Alexandria's pursuit of zoning laws. And it's because of a special road that the federal government is very concerned about. We know it as GW Parkway. At the time, it was called Memorial Boulevard. The National Capital Park and Planning Commission, which was establishing the Memorial Boulevard, was very concerned about the view that tourists would have traveling from Washington, D.C. to Mount Vernon. And as such, began to put pressure on the city of Alexandria to clean up that route. In fact, so much so that Alexandria hired the chief engineer of the National Capital Park and Planning Commission to create a zoning plan for the city. And this is what it looked like. There's actually a series of maps. So for sake of brevity, I've only added 2 of them. So on the right, this is actually our first zoning map. You can see the residential areas as well as commercial and industrial spaces. Of particular note for our conversation tonight, I would like to point out the fact of how African-American neighborhoods overlap, if not are adjacent to industrial areas in the city. Of course, these are probably some of the most unhealthful places to live in the city, and people recognize that at the time. In addition, on the left, this is actually a school distribution map. Irving Root, when he developed this map, noticed that the best practice in terms of school placement, especially elementary schools, was that all children would live within a half a mile of that school. And he would argue that for the most part, Alexandria meets that best practice. However, Alexandria's public schools are segregated, and he did not actually apply these same metrics to African-American schools. And of course, there were only 2 African-American elementary schools at this time, Parker Gray in the eastern part of the city and Seminary in the western part, which clearly would not meet the best practices of the time. I'm going to go back to the other slide. So with Alexandria's passage of this ordinance created by Irving Root, it actually quickly ends up in the courts. West Brothers Brick Company, which is like she sells seashells for me, versus Alexandria 1937, ended up in the Virginia State Supreme Court, questioning the legitimacy of our zoning laws. Now, this particular case involves a piece of property here on the right, which you all probably know as Powhatan Street, this area right between Route 1 and GW Parkway. Well, West Brothers Brick Company had actually bought it for clay mining, and their goal was actually to dig about 15 to 20 feet down to basically take out all the clay for brick making and tile making, which they had been doing for over 20, 30 years in the Washington metropolitan area. Unfortunately for them, it was redistricted residential because of GW Parkway, and they had eventually to sell their property. But of particular note in this Supreme Court case was the fact that they do note that African Americans are living in this area within heavy industry, and there seems to be no concern whatsoever about the health conditions that are by living so close to heavy industry. All right, so I've talked about local and state forces. I now want to talk a little bit about federal forces that adversely impacted African American access to housing. This starts really with the New Deal. Now, what's funny about the New Deal is in many ways, when we look at the legislation, that if you read them without thinking about the context, that they are very positive pieces of legislation. However, the way in which they are applied means that African Americans do not have equitable access to resources that white residents have. Now, the first piece of legislation of note was actually the Homeowners Loan Corporation Act of 1933. This particular legislation allowed for the refinancing of foreclose mortgages so that homeowners ultimately wouldn't lose their property. It was basically a sort of get out of jail free situation. Now with the Homeowners Loan Corporation, however, this entity started creating maps to delineate what they deemed to be risk. High risk in particular became associated with African-American neighborhoods. We know these maps as redlining maps, but the Homeowners Loan Corporation was not the only entity that created these maps. The Federal Housing Administration also made these maps. The Federal Housing Administration made the map in front of you, and if you noticed in the lower right-hand corner, this is Alexandria. The Federal Housing Administration basically provide insurance to banks who gave people mortgages, but they too delineated African-American homeowners or neighborhoods as high risk. So notice that most of the eastern part of the city of Alexandria is an F1. And if you look on the left, I've given you an excerpt of the language from F. There's like a big sort of key that goes with this map that talks about the condition of the buildings, but also the large number of African Americans who live in this area. For the FHA, this would potentially deem this neighborhood or this area ineligible for these types of mortgages, but people did get them. One group that got federally backed FHA loans were apartment complexes in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. But in order to get these loans, they had to include a restrictive covenants to guarantee that they would only rent to white residences. As you can see here, over 3,000 apartment units in the city that were constructed during this time would not allow African Americans to live in them. Some of them, Shirley Duke is actually Fox Chase today. I know like some of the names have changed over time. In addition, some of these loans were actually used for historic preservation in the city for white residents. This property here was actually restored in 1938 through an FHA-backed loan. It was such a big deal that actually officials from Washington came to see it. Even Gatsby's Tavern got an FHA-backed loan to fix their roof in the 1930s. In addition to the Federal Housing Administration, we also have public housing coming in the 1930s. And again, this is tied to another National Housing Act that was passed in 1937. But in order for Alexandria to pursue having a public housing authority, they needed to do some research to figure out what the housing situation was, both in terms of need, but also the quality of housing in the city. They hired the Works Progress Administration to do that. And this is actually one of many maps that the WPA created for the city of Alexandria, which basically became the foundation of public housing for the city. So here, this is actually looking at the racial percentages in the per block in the city in 1939. With this data in hand, the city began to pursue the establishment of public housing. What I'd like to point out is there are a couple of things. First and foremost, it's all clustered in historic African-American neighborhoods, particularly uptown and the Burg. Not only that, because they're targeting those areas, that does not mean that those are necessarily public housing units that cater to people within the community. Oftentimes, because public housing was segregated, these would be white-only public housing units. In addition to that, they used eminent domain to take property from African Americans in a time when there were very few other housing alternatives. Of course, this land was the modicum of wealth that they had at that time. And now they're facing an environment where they either have to leave the city or they have to go into public housing themselves. Here on the left is somebody who's speaking just to what I'm talking about. Lynn Ellis is facing in 1939 the potential of losing her home to make way for public housing. And again, she speaks honestly about the condition of the homes, but also that they are being adversely impacted by the construction of public housing in very particular neighborhoods. Finally, we have urban renewal. Now, urban renewal is also actually a New Deal program, but in the 1930s, it focused on residential neighborhoods. After World War II, however, it is expanded to include commercial developments as well. It's at this time that the city of Alexandria decides to pursue urban renewal funding. Now, what's interesting about that is that in the 1940s and 1950s, the city government in particular is concerned about housing conditions in the uptown neighborhood. Now, there's some real world concerns going on. These are homes that do not have plumbing. They have an outhouse, right? They do not have sewage. They do not have heat. So really adverse housing conditions in the city and very little recourse in terms of demanding that owners of these properties improve the conditions. However, the city, when they pursue urban renewal funding, do not try to deal with the housing issues in the uptown neighborhood. They use the funding to create spaces that will appeal to white middle-class families. Thus, the money goes towards 3 projects: the Gatsby Urban Renewal Project, which is the commercial corridor along King Street, the construction of T.C. Williams High School, and the establishment of Fort Ward Park and Museum. Fort Ward Park and Museum and T.C. Williams are on historic African-American neighborhoods that were established immediately after the American Civil War. Gatsby Urban Renewal Project, these were businesses, many of which were owned actually by immigrants. And I've actually talked to the son of a Greek immigrant family that owned one of these businesses that actually still exists in the city today. So some of you might know what business I'm talking about, who felt that the city was targeting Southern and Eastern European immigrants, much in the same way that they also targeted African-American residents. So I've been talking about all the bad stuff, and I do want to also point out that the amount of activism around the issue of housing that is going on in this period as well. There are many organizations and individuals, I don't have enough time tonight to actually talk about all of them, who, when facing this adversity in terms of maintaining and keeping their homes, turn to a variety of resources. Most notably, we find individuals turning to courts or getting lawyers to fight eminent domain or at least demand more money. One of my favorite stories involves a farmer named John Peters, who owned 10 acres of land in the western part of the city that was going to be part of Fort Ward Park and Museum, but he did not want to sell it to the city. He ended up selling it to a Catholic school known as Extension Academy. That is now St. Stephen's and St. Agnes Middle School today. So that's a fun fact about the school. In addition, you also had organized action on the part of civil rights organizations within the city. They're both local ones, but also national ones or chapters of national ones at work. For our purposes here, I'd like to highlight the Seminary Civic Association. The Seminary Civic Association, led by Lieutenant Colonel Marion Johnson, who's photographed here on the left, was very vocal about the displacement that they were going to face for the construction of T.C. Williams High School. These were the individuals who lived in this area that basically had faced eminent domain and had no place to live. Through the work of Johnson and other activists within the community, they forced the city to put aside several acres of land to build homes for them. In addition, they're just across from Episcopal High School. So you can actually see this home right here is actually painted dark gray. If you ever drive down Quaker Lane, you'll see it. In addition to the work of the Seminary Civic Association, we also see examples of direct action, most notably through a group called ACCESS, which is an awesome acronym, but a really long name, the Action Coordinating Committee to End Segregation in the Suburbs. ACCESS focused on organizing marches. In particular, they actually did a march around the Beltway to highlight the issues of segregation in the suburbs around the Washington metropolitan area. In addition, they organized a march from Gum Springs to basically the 14th Street Bridge, highlighting particularly the issues facing African Americans here in Northern Virginia. Besides their marches, they also knocked on doors of developers and apartment managers, asking them to sign an equal access document saying that they would rent apartments to African Americans if African Americans applied. And again, this is all in the 1960s. Finally, we also start to see legislation impacting all the damage that was done from the 1920s through the early part of the 1960s. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, this demanded the desegregation of any programming that received federal funds. This included public housing. And that's actually what the photograph is here on the left. This is the John Roberts Public Housing, which is no longer standing. It's basically at the intersection of West and Braddock Road, and there's some commercial and some condominiums there today. In addition, the city actually passed its own voluntary housing ordinance in 1967. It was not mandatory, but it was considered progress at the time. And Alexandria was the second city to pass such an ordinance, requesting that apartment owners and managers be willing to open up their properties regardless of race, religion, or creed. Finally, the federal government passes the Federal Housing Act, or the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which requires racial equality in terms of both rental and regular real estate as well. Virginia is a little bit of a Holly come lately in all of this, but finally does pass its own law in 1972. Finally, the last two pieces of legislation that I have listed here, these are about access to money, because it's one thing to be able to access property in terms of rental. It's also an issue of accessing loans and mortgages. Both of these pieces of legislation focused on making sure that African Americans had access to mortgages for both real estate for homes, but also for businesses as well. And with that, I'm going to open it up for some questions.
Thank you very much, Kristin. I've always been fascinated by Alexandria's, sometimes it feels like desperation to highlight white population in the city, certainly to attract it. And I'm just curious, did the city have a large Black population after the Civil War compared to other jurisdictions?
So
what was going on?
So it's a sort of an interesting situation. So if we're talking immediately after the Civil War, we see massive demographic changes because Alexandria is a safe haven for self-emancipating African Americans throughout the Washington metro region. So in that sense, yes. But when we get into the 20th century, what the real game changer is the fact that we have a sizable number of African Americans who have been able to purchase property that they own real estate. And that's a lot more difficult to navigate if you're trying to segregate populations. And that's why things like eminent domain become such a powerful tool in changing the racial demographics of the city. We do, comparative to especially Fairfax County, have much larger numbers of African American residents. And at times, if you look at that map, you will see that the racial breakdown in terms of demographics shift block by block. Whereas if you look at a place like Fairfax County, it is actually much more rigid in terms of the racial demographics. You do not see that sort of modeledness in the ways that we see here in the city. So there is something to say that that's unique about the city of Alexandria, that it is not so stark, even though you do see segregation in terms of the layout in general.
I see that Sue has her hand raised.
Oh, hi. I just put it in the chat as well. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Hi. I just particularly interested. Thank you very much for this. It's super fascinating. I followed a lot of it over time. I think that one of the things with TC that I found, it's horrible, but the same process took place over like Wilson High School and Fort Reno in DC. I think it was like one of those sort of tactics that was used in many places, was to put a big public schoolhouse on a property that was, so that's sad. My particular question about TC is, I know that the housing like built by Simpson there in Woods Place, would you say that there was maybe like 20% of the families were given housing? I mean, I know that they demanded it. I don't want to gloss that over, that it wasn't like they were just handed housing, but I'm just wondering, I don't think it was a very big percentage. I'm just wondering if you have any idea of.
Off the top of my head, I don't. So first of all, talking about urban renewal, which is, when you're talking about, that's why a lot of African Americans don't call it urban renewal, they call it urban removal. And there is some, legitimacy, because that's what it was. That's how it's being used. In terms of who is able to acquire the houses along Quaker Lane, it's actually, I think it's a much larger number than you think. There is a study though, which if Special Collections was open, I'd say go check it out. There was a master's thesis done by a Howard University student in the late 1960s who actually studied the impact of Colonel Johnson's work and whether or not people actually were able to buy those homes. And she found that a large number of them did buy them, and only a very small, and I'm talking like 2 or 3, were actually forced to leave the city of Alexandria. And so the opportunity to purchase those homes was a positive thing, at least in terms of her project. And some of the descendants, they're still living there today. They recognize that was a critical moment that could have literally erased their community from that part of the city.
There's another question in the chat. It's a big but important one. Would you say that systemic racism still exists in housing today, or did the past legislation handle it? Also, do past racist policies affect housing today in the area? And I think probably some of our next speakers will be getting to this too, but
yeah. So, one of the things that I'm looking at right now is when the period of very explicit restrictive covenants that have clear racist language in them, when that becomes unconstitutional, what happens next? And so what happens next is that you see class-based language. And that, again, is a way to discriminate against African Americans, because, of course, when we're talking about the 1950s, 60s, the majority of them did not have the access to types of capital, right, and mortgages and loans to build a $10,000 house, which is actually the amount I found as a restriction on a covenant here in the city from the early part of the 1950s. And so that's the pattern that I start to see, is that they use class-based, that's a cover really for race-based restrictive housing covenants after the Kramer case in 1948. Some of that still persists with us today, that you still will find restrictive covenants on properties that technically, I would argue, impacts people based upon their occupation or the family structure that they live in. And again, this wouldn't just affect African Americans living in the city, but I would argue immigrants and refugees as well. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do on that front in terms of being more inclusive, but there are other people who are better experts on this who are going to talk tonight.
Are there any other questions?
I'll have one more question.
Okay.
During this time, what was the role of the seminary? I mean, they are sort of smack dab there between Fort Ward and the site of TC. Was it just, quiet, or was there any opposition to the urban removal from Seminary?
So as far as I can tell, so we can talk about VTS versus Episcopal High School, right?
Right.
They're two separate entities in the mid 20th century, both of which are major employers of African Americans within the neighborhood. Historically. And that's also why we see African Americans settling in that area, is because of the job opportunities that these two institutions have that differ than domestic work or agricultural work. And here I'm talking right after the American Civil War. That said, the Episcopal Church, and many people on this call know, struggled in terms of integration throughout its history in the 19th and early 20th century, and was often silent on these issues in the mid 20th century. But that said, we did have African American Episcopal ministers who actually were working in the area. In fact, we had an Episcopal church on the site of Fort Ward known as St. Cyprian's. That has been torn down, but it existed there from the 1920s through the 1940s. And it was actually a replacement for another church that was on the grounds of VTS that catered to African-American residents in the area. So it's a complicated history, to say the least. But I will say that I know VTS is doing a reparations program today. And in fact, the Alexandria Historical Society, we are having one of the folks who's part of that project speak in a couple weeks about the reparations program. So if folks are interested in learning more about that, I can send out that information to Alice and she can share it with folks.
Okay. If there are no other questions, we'll move to the next part of our evening, in which we are going to hear from several people who work hard to preserve the supply of affordable housing for the middle class. Yes, the middle class, as well as lower income families of all races and ethnicities. You'll be hearing from Helen Mcelveen, who has been part of the city's Office of Housing since 2006 and has run the department since 2015. She leads the city's efforts to produce and preserve affordable housing citywide under the city's housing master plan, which she'll tell you about. She and her office work with nonprofits and also private developers, as well as the local redevelopment and housing authority. Since 2017, she has been part of city and regional efforts to enhance housing affordability in anticipation of the arrival of Amazon, and also the Virginia Tech Innovation Campus. And both of those will be in the Route 1 corridor in the north part of the city. The next speakers after Helen will be Janelle Diaz and Janelle Diaz, who are not related, but are a team at the city's Redevelopment and Housing Authority. Both have devoted their passion and dedication to helping some of the city's least affluent residents to find and keep decent, safe, and affordable homes. Janelle Diaz is the Director of Asset Management for ARHA. She administers all the federal voucher-funded public housing and mixed income programs for the authority and manages operations at virtually all the housing units under its control. Janelle Diaz directs resident and community services at ARHA. In this COVID year, that's meant helping residents with food security, unemployment challenges, referrals for mental health issues, and at the moment, making sure that those who are eligible all get vaccinated. She also organizes outreach events for residents, one of which is the Youth Arts Festival. And John Frederick, who is CEO of Alexandria Housing Development Corporation, which has been adding units to the city's affordable housing stock for more than 15 years. He has run the organization since 2015, and under his leadership, AHDC has developed, renovated, and acquired nearly 700 housing units spread across 8 projects earmarked for residents with limited incomes, most of them people of color. In the pipeline are 2 more developments that, if approved, will nearly double the company's affordable housing offerings and provide homes for 1,800 people. So next we will go to Helen Mcelveen to talk about the city's Office of Housing and what you do. Oops, I think you're,
Yep.
okay.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be with you this evening. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to hear Professor Moon. It is hard to follow her. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and tell you about the city's housing master plan. And I'm going to just, so in 2013, the city did a housing master plan. The theme was housing for all. And that meant creating more housing options for people at all incomes, life stages, and abilities. And so we took a very broad look at what our housing goals were. And of course, in addition to that, we wanted housing to be energy efficient, healthy, and safe, and accessible. And we also are striving to have a citywide distribution of affordable units. And that's because as a city, we value social and cultural and racial diversity, as well as creating mixed income communities, which we think is sort of the right way to, the gold standard. And our goal from the housing master plan was actually a target to create new affordability in 2,000 units by 2025. And we say it that way because in addition to producing new affordable units, we're also very interested in preserving what is already affordable and keeping it that way. So we're making good progress on our housing master plan. We expect to achieve our goal. We currently have several 481 units that are yet in the development pipeline to get to the 481. And some of you may know that last March, City Council also endorsed a regional housing initiative that would take our goal of 2,000 and put another 2,250 affordable and workforce units in Alexandria's stock of committed housing by 2030. And this is part of what Alice referred to, kind of our goal. What do we need for the jobs and work that the city is competing for? And so this would be part of our response to being economically competitive, making sure people can live here so they're spending their dollars here and not clogging the roadways, but also so that we are attractive to employers and people, as I said, sort of have options when it comes to their housing. So I think this is always interesting to see, kind of typical hourly wages in this area and what people make. And the reason it's interesting is that to afford a 1-bedroom apartment, an average 1-bedroom apartment in the city, you need to make almost $37 an hour. And so what you can see is that to be able to afford a 1-bedroom apartment, someone who's working as a fast food cook would in essence need to have 3 jobs just to be able to pay for that 1 bedroom. So demand for affordable housing is driven by many things. On the top, you see a bar graph that shows that compared wages are not going up nearly as much as the cost of housing. So here you see that the cost of buying a home has gone up more than 200% since the year 2000. And we have lost, you'll often hear this phrase, we've lost market affordable housing. That means that apartments that were affordable in the year 2000 are no longer affordable to people who are making 60% of the area median income. And so it's not, in very few cases are the units actually gone. It's just that the rents have gone up and they're no longer affordable to many working people. And some of this is also that our area has seen a huge growth in the types of jobs that are in lower wage sectors, like retail, like hospitality, like food service. So most Alexandrians who are low to moderate income, in fact, most families that make $75,000 or less a year actually are housing cost burden, meaning they spend far more than 30% of their income on housing. And this means that they have fewer dollars of disposable income to spend on healthcare, education, daycare, savings, good food. So this would be about 15,000, 14,500 families that are housing cost burden, spending far more than we think is appropriate on their housing, simply because of the cost. The other thing that you'll see is then most people who work in the city actually come here from other places because they've drive to a place they can afford. So we get affordable housing through our zoning and financing tools, and this would be bonus density, use of the RMF zone that was used at the recent Heritage Project. We get money from developers that we invest to help nonprofits and private developers in ARHA build housing. We also work with partners like nonprofits and others. And then we also try to do very innovative things, like the city put housing above a fire station out in Potomac Yard. We know that one thing our city does not have enough of is land. So we're looking for ways to combine uses and make the best use of all of our land and public assets. So it used to be, even just a few years ago, that the city would have to invest about $40,000 to create an affordable unit. Now, between both the cost of development and construction, you've probably heard about how expensive construction costs have become, as well as our desire to provide deeper levels of affordability. The city is now investing between $80,000 and $95,000 per affordable unit. And each affordable unit, if you drive around the city, it's usually very hard, unless you know it before you drive past, to know what is an affordable rental building. I think that most of our affordable developments are as beautiful or more beautiful than other buildings that we have in the city. So each affordable unit costs about $450,000 to build. They have underground parking, they have other amenities, and they're built to be energy efficient. So they have a lot of things that really make them fit in well with their neighborhoods and kind of contribute seamlessly to the neighborhoods. So these are all buildings in the city that have affordable housing, and we get our affordable housing in many different ways, by working with partners, co-locating with city facilities, and of course, sometimes when there are new residential buildings, we will get units in those buildings, especially if they have used density, additional height, or additional square footage to build the building. And I think if you were to look at these, you wouldn't necessarily pick any out and say, oh, that's affordable housing. In fact, you might say that's a really well-designed building. We also try to plan for housing when we do all of our small area planning. So just to give you an idea of what's happened only in the last 10 years, these are all the places where the city has been planning or revising plans, and we are planning for affordable housing as part of the new communities being built. And right now we're very involved with Alexandria, which is, as you know, a section of the city that has really experienced both housing and health issues during the pandemic. So this describes some of the things we do to try to expand housing affordability and equity. We measure our progress in meeting the goals, and we take a report card to AHAC every quarter because we think that being accountable and tracking our progress is a good practice to know how we're doing. We've created a pilot rental subsidy that to create more affordable units within each, to create more affordability within new tax credit projects. Tax credits are a major source of how new housing is built. We also try to foster partnerships among nonprofits and private developers. So I think John will tell you about the Bloom, the partnership between AHDC and Carpenter Shelter, which led to the Bloom project, which opened last fall. We worked with Episcopal Church of the Resurrection and AHC on the Spire. The Waypoint is a partnership between Fairlington Presbyterian Church and Wesley Housing. At the Nexus, AHDC worked with private developers to build 74 affordable units. And right now we're also working at Landmark Mall, and that will be a collaboration among the city, developer Folger Pratt and Inova, and will include affordable housing. So we are also now, because of, as Professor Moon was telling us, a really long history of housing inequity and lack of access, we're particularly interested in projects that may offer affordable home ownership. And so one of those is AHDC's newest proposal for a home ownership project on Seminary Road. And I think this has been a time where we've learned a lot about housing, health, and equity. This is, I call accessory dwelling units, making room for neighbors. The city just approved an amendment to the zoning ordinance to allow these secondary units. Here what you see is one that is separate from the house above a garage, and it basically allows the owner of the primary residence to rent space or offer space to someone who needs a more affordable option. The ADU ordinance also allows you to create space within your home that can be rented. John is going to talk about this project, so I won't, but obviously we're very focused on Arlandria and creating units that will be deeply affordable and be responsive to the housing needs of that community. I think when we saw the disproportionate impact of the pandemic, it largely reflected that the way many families there can afford housing is by sharing housing with other earners. So you very often will see people who are sharing, you know, a family has one of the bedrooms in a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment, and they figure out who gets to use the kitchen. So here you also, I've got some, a chart that shows different levels of affordability. And so we have many families. You will hear us talk a lot about things affordable at 60% AMI. So just to give you an idea of what that translates to in terms of money, it would be $53,000 for one person, and for a 4-person household, about $75,000. So I know some people are surprised to learn that even families that are making, you know, $75,000, $80,000, $90,000 can really struggle to afford housing in our city. So that's the end of my prepared remarks, and I'm glad to take your questions on chat or later. Thank you.
Alice, you're muted.
Sorry. We'll wait for questions until we've heard from Janelle and Gaynell, and also John Frederick. So next, if you would welcome the Diaz women from ARHA.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here, hopefully. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Well, thank you, everyone. Alice and everyone. Janelle and I are very pleased to be here tonight to talk a little bit about ARHA and explain how our programs work, and hopefully answer some of your questions. What we wanted to start out by doing was, a lot of times, when people, they sort of group everything together. So I wanted to start out by explaining the difference between our public housing program and our housing choice voucher program. And as Professor Moon indicated, ARHA was actually established in 1939. And so that is when we first got the federal funding to establish housing in the city of Alexandria. So public housing is considered developments that are, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to make sure that my pictures, I apologize, are sort of blocking my slide a little bit here. Okay, there we go. That are constructed and operated by a subsidy. It was established by state law so that we could provide safe and affordable housing for low-income families, individuals, elderly, and persons with disabilities. HUD actually oversees the public housing program, and then the Housing Authority is the one that administers and manages the properties. Our tenants pay rent that's based on 30% of the family's adjusted gross income. And there are income limits at qualification, but they can stay in public housing as long as they comply with their lease. And currently we have about 1,081 public housing units in the city of Alexandria. Our housing choice voucher program, which a lot of people know, it was formerly known as Section 8, so the name has changed now, is a rental subsidy program that's also administered by ARHA. It allows applicants to locate and choose housing that meets the requirements of the program. So both of them, public housing and HCVP, are subsidy programs. One of the main differences being with public housing, the subsidy is with the unit itself. And with our voucher program, it's actually the subsidy is with, I would say, the family, because it's based off of their family size, and they can actually, it's portable. So it can move around as long as they have a landlord that is a part of the program. We are landlords to some units, but they can also find another landlord as long as they meet that criteria and maintain, all the, the criteria. So that's the main difference, is that the voucher is portable and the public housing is not. Again, our tenants pay that 30% portion. It goes directly to the owner or their landlord, and then the voucher will then cover the remaining difference of what the tenant's portion is for the actual rent. And again, the income limits qualification are only at their initial certification, and as long as they comply with their lease, they're allowed to maintain their voucher. And we currently have 1,547 vouchers that we are administering. So some of the data and both of the programs are pretty similar, so we've kind of combined this in terms of the makeup. In terms of heads of household, we have 74% are female and 26% are male. 14% of our participants are 65 and older, what we consider seniors. 14% also indicate that they have some type of disability that meets the HUD criteria. The average family size, 73% of our households have 4 people or less. And in terms of household income, 87% make under $40,000 per year. So the median ARHA income for a family is $16,000 annually, as compared to $87,319 for the general Alexandria residents. And I didn't add on this slide, and I apologize, but I did go look, we got some extra data in terms of racial data. About 90% of our residents are also African-American, 6% Caucasian, and then we also have about 6% that are also Latino. So, I mean, in terms of ethnicity. So a few years ago, ARHA actually did a market study because we wanted to look at like income levels and assess our current inventory, and sort of as we are looking to redevelop some of our properties to see, you know, what the market was demanding. So I know that when what we determined is that there is obviously this huge need for more housing, especially for the families that fall at like the 30% AMI or below, and that's primarily the residents that we serve. And from that, ARHA set a goal that as we start to continue to redevelop our existing properties, that our goal is to not only bring back the number of units that we currently have on each site, but also be able to expand and, you know, provide other units throughout the city. And so I know that one of the questions Alex had asked me to sort of expand in terms of the existing properties. So for instance, we have, you know, an older developments that I think Professor Moon mentioned in her slideshow, but something like Hopkins Tansel or Samuel Madding or Andrew Atkins. So those properties that are in like that uptown area, the Parker Gray area, and in the Berg, those are definitely some of our older properties that, you know, we are looking into redeveloping. And again, those are ones that we want to make sure that we can at least maintain the same number of units that we have. So that brings me, you know, to our recent waitlist opening. And I'm sorry. Okay. And the response that we got to that, and I apologize, I think, I want to apologize. I'm going to go back. I'm going to explain how the wait list works first, and then I will get into some of the most recent data. So we do have a wait list for both our public housing and our housing choice voucher programs. They're separate and people have to sign up for each one independently. Our specific preferences are what, when people sign up, they're given assigned preferences, and that affects their position on the list. So some of the things that influence what those preferences are like their residency status, like are they Alexandria resident versus, you know, DC, for example. Their current housing status, like if they're actually currently homeless, if they are elderly or disabled, if they are a veteran, and also their family size or what we call composition. And so after the preferences, then their position is also affected by the date and time that we actually receive their application. Our public housing applicants are actually pulled from the waiting list based on when the units become available due to various reasons. People move out or sometimes pass away, or if there's lease violations or their evictions. And so recently we have been averaging about 10 available units per month. And it usually takes us about 21 days to turn over a unit and prepare it for a new family. So, you know, if you think about that, maybe, you know, if we have like 1,000 people, for example, on a wait list, and we're only getting about 10 units a month, then, you know, that's basically, you know, like 120 units a year that 120 families that we would actually be processing a year, theoretically, off of a list that might have like 1,000. So that's part of the challenge as to why it takes so long for people to actually, you know, come off the waiting list. Similar story with our housing choice voucher applicants. They are pulled from this based on the funding that we get from HUD. So as funding is sometimes decreased, obviously that impacts, you know, the amount of vouchers that we're able to provide. If they're pulled off the list, they are given 120 days to actually find a unit. And on the average, when we have families that find something, they usually have 60 to 90 days left when they have found a unit that they would like to, that they qualify for, and it's approved for them to move into. So we recently opened our waiting list for the first time since 2011. And initially, I think a lot of people heard we had this, the big number of 45,000. And so we've been processing and verifying those applications to determine eligibility. So they've actually been migrating our system, but we're still, you know, doing some additional verifications to make sure that families are being matched with the, you know, appropriate list for certain properties. And so right now our numbers on our list are for public housing, 25,491, and our housing choice voucher program, 13,728. So really big numbers. I then wanted to talk about a little bit about, in our time left, just about, the RACS department, which is Resident Community Services, and what we do, in addition to working with partnerships for programs and trying to create initiatives for residents. I know Alice is very familiar with Ruby Tucker Family Center. We work a lot with the Alexandria City Public Schools. We have a 21st Century grant. We have a community gardening program that we've been doing for over 10 years. And Alice has been a really vital volunteer in helping to work with the children with that program. We have the Senior Center at Charles Houston, which is a contract that we have through the city. We also have a HUD-based program called Resident Opportunity and Self-Sufficiency, which actually works with residents and helps them set goals and identify things that they can do to improve with their education or employment opportunities, whatever things that they want to work on. And then James Bland 5 Supportive Services is actually something that we did in conjunction with our developer, EYA, when we redeveloped James Bland. And they actually put in funding for us to have a specific person to work with residents there. It's very similar to like a Ross, but she works specifically with the residents in that development. And again, provides them with helps them with employment and training opportunities. So that's why it's supportive services. And we also, again, do a lot of things with DCHS, workforce development, Alive, just, several things, several organizations throughout the city just to provide support for our residents. The pandemic, we've actually seen 20% of our residents that have been affected in terms of income and their ability to pay rent. And most of the areas where they have requested extra assistance are food. We've worked with Alive to do a lot, and ACPS to actually do a lot of distributions in some of our various developments throughout the city, in addition to the pop-up locations. We've made sure that residents have been able to apply for the pandemic EBT cards or SNAP benefits that were being offered through ACPS as well as through the state. Employment, we had a lot of residents that were having trouble either getting through to VEC to file claims, unemployment claims, and also some of them that wanted to sort of either find additional skills. We were able to refer them to workforce development for virtual training. Education, that was a biggie, making sure that all of our families had connectivity. We worked with them to sometimes make sure they had the Khajiits, which provided Wi-Fi service in their home, or even to make sure they could get Comcast, the free internet service for a year. There were some grants at ACPS that had some families that were able to qualify for that. Mental health, again, working with sometimes counselors, school social workers, and even DCHS to have people, help people with counseling services, because it was a lot of anxiety. And we have some families that sometimes didn't even want to leave the house. They didn't want the kids to leave the house. I mean, we were under quarantine, but not even to just step out and get air. It was, really just sort of a complete lockdown. So we were helping residents with that. The biggie, rental assistance. And we have a group of emergency financial providers throughout the city that we work with, in addition to DCHS. The city, when rental assistance program, when they have funds, and Helen, and Eric, they were really vital in helping us get residents assistance. And now the Virginia Rent Relief Program. And also, another challenge has been security deposit assistance. There have been some families that have obviously, if they had to move in, or maybe they had to change a unit for a various reason, maybe their landlord sold the property and they had to find somewhere else to live. This has sort of been a big challenge for us recently. There's a law, that was passed now that, apartment complexes can no longer discriminate against someone if they have a voucher. And so one of the things that a challenge that we might have found is that we will have residents that can get approved, but maybe because of their credit or different things, they have to provide 2 months rent for a security deposit. And it's not the 30% of the rent, it's the 2 months of the market value of the rent. So if the apartment would normally go for $2,000, they have to come up with $4,000 in a security deposit, which is, I think, very daunting for, a lot of folks, but particularly if you are, already making like lower income. So we've been, sort of struggling, to help residents or, families if they're moving to, meet this need. And we do have a few churches, but I'll just say one of the security deposit programs, like their normal amount that they provide is $300 in assistance. So it's sort of like, we have to kind of piece together and go to a lot of places. And whereas there may be some places in the past that would say they would let a family move in and sort of have a payment plan, a lot of the apartment complex recently won't allow that. And one of the things they've shared is that, well, we would do this for any of our clients, any person moving in, we want to treat everybody the same and equitable. So you have to provide all $4,000 before you're allowed to move in. And so I look at it as like, sort of like a double-edged sword, because in a way, I think it's discriminatory without being overtly discriminatory, because then all of a sudden it's more of, again, a class thing, because we can say that if you can't afford it, then, you still can't move in and provide a better home or living situation for your family. So I think that was the end of my presentation. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. So I will stop sharing, and and then Janelle and I will both be available for questions, anything at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. John Frederick.
Good evening, everyone. I'll share my screen here quickly and get this moving. All right. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. I know it's getting late in the evening here, and I want to leave some time for questions. And actually, my last slide is the one that I want to spend the most time on, because it's a new couple programs that we're looking on. Helen highlighted it a little bit, that I think really kind of gets to the heart of some of the issues that we're talking about. So thank you so much for having me. My name again is John Frederick, President and CEO of the Alexandria Housing Development Corporation. AHDC was founded in 2004. It was a city initiative that was looking at these affordable housing issues. It's been an ongoing issue for years. And in 2004, a recommendation that came out of that initiative was that Alexandria should have its own 501c3 nonprofit that would be working here exclusively in the city. And so that's what we do. I've been working at the organization since 2015. So a little bit about where we work. Once again, we only work in the city of Alexandria, the actual physical boundaries of the city. And this slide here just provides a little bit of a flavor of where our properties are spread around town. We're proud of the fact that even though a lot of our stuff is kind of on that Route 1 Old Town East Side corridor, we do have projects that are spread throughout the city limits. So who do we serve? This is a question that we get a lot. Not only the demographics that we serve, but kind of where do they work? Where do the folks in our buildings work, and kind of incomes they make, that type of thing. So HDC's households, and I can share these slides with whoever that we can send them out, so you can dig into these numbers a little bit more if you so choose. But on average, our households make about 44% of the area median income. That's around $55,000 for a family of four. Yeah, let me just move this here. Yeah, on average, 72% of the adults over 18 in our units are employed, and that is, interestingly enough, almost identical to the employment stats of Alexandria as a whole. 34% of our population is under the age of 19, as compared to the city of Alexandria, that's considerably higher. So I think it's easy to say, or we serve a lot of children. And there's a lot of teenagers and children that live within our properties. And as we've been talking about tonight, due to systemic racism and various housing markets in general, HTC residents are more likely to be Black or Latinx. In fact, 90% of our population identify themselves as a person of color. This is not exhaustive of the properties that we own, but it's maybe some that you have seen in your travels around town. Helen mentioned earlier the partnership with the Carpenter Shelter that we redeveloped starting in 2018 and just finished up in the beginning or at the end of last year, excuse me. But it's at the corner of North Henry and First Street, about quarter mile from the Braddock Metro. It's where the Carpenter Shelter used to be, which was the original home of the DMV in the area. We redeveloped this. We put a new purpose-built Carpenter Shelter in the first floor. It's about the same square footage of the old shelter, but 1 story, so fully accessible and purpose-built for their needs. 97 units above that structure, and 10 of those units are for the chronically homeless. I'm very proud to say that one of the residents that moved into this unit had been homeless, street homeless, kind of going into Carpenter Shelter to check in and stuff for over 20 years. So it's just an amazing thing to be able to get somebody in a unit. The station at Potomac Yard was the first project that AHDC did. This project was finished in 2009. It was the first building that was built in Potomac Yard. The fire station was built there to serve the kind of now booming area of Potomac Yard, and the city used a pretty creative process, the city and AHDC, to put 64 units above it. As you've heard throughout the presentation or throughout the night about units that are lost due to just rents increasing faster than incomes, AHDC focuses about half of our resources, about half our portfolio is on properties that we acquire, maintain as affordable housing, and do usually some type of renovation. The Parkstone Alexandria was a project that we acquired at the beginning of 2020, right before the pandemic started. It was I've kept the marketing brochure on this, and it's one of the things I'll probably keep forever, but the marketing brochure was sent out to that said, no affordable housing restrictions, opportunity for value add and increased rents over time, right? So this is the play that capital comes in, buys one of these types of buildings, puts in granite countertops, changes the floors a little bit, increases the rent 20 to 30%. And that's just, it's been done time and time again. We were able to use a number of very creative financing sources, buy this property off the market, competing with market rate developers. Big thanks to the city and Virginia Housing for coming up with the capital needs to do that. But we closed on this deal in a little over 60 days. And so this 326 units that we took from the market to make a permanent affordable housing solution in the city. Lacey Court is a property that we have owned since 2008, or actually 2011, excuse me. It was owned since 2008 by nonprofits with the use of city money. But we renovated this project, finalized it in the beginning part of 2020, and put a significant amount of rehab into the units to make sure that, one, it's a safe place to live, two, it's a community asset and will remain affordable in perpetuity. So this is where I wanted to spend the most of my time tonight here, and I can kind of answer any questions on this. But there's 2 projects that we have in the pipeline right now that are going through the approval process with the city. The first project on the left of your screen is a project on Seminary Road. Anybody that is familiar with this part of town, it's right next to the fire station. We have put together 3 parcels, one that was owned by Sheltered Homes of Alexandria, one is a private owner, and another is an acre owned by the city. And we are proposing to build 31 townhouses, 6 flats, and 3 units for Sheltered Homes of Alexandria. We will make these units available for purchase for people under 80% of AMI, but we are anticipating trying to serve as many under 60 as possible. The goal is to help residents that are living in our communities now go through programs, use the down payment assistance programs that are available, and get into a home ownership opportunity. The goal will be to put this in a community land trust or some similar real estate structure that will allow the resident and the family to gain wealth over time, but have a little bit of a cap on what that equity could be, so that when they go to sell, they'll be required to sell it to another affordable home ownership opportunity, or another family looking for affordable home ownership opportunity. And so it's a way to keep some affordability in perpetuity, but also allow the family to build wealth, both by paying down their mortgage, one, two, stabilizing their housing costs, because even affordable housing rents go up over time. This will stabilize their housing costs and allow them to keep any income that they make over time. And then three, having a shared version of some of that equity as the property continues to appreciate. The property on the right is a project that we are proposing in the Alexandria neighborhood portion of town. This is an area that we feel, and I think the city of Office of Housing probably agrees, that is under intense pressure for gentrification and redevelopment, especially as Amazon has come to the area, but just also the Virginia Tech campus and just the the Potomac Yard Metro. So this is an area where we are proposing a much larger project, taking surface parking lots, turning them into units, and hopefully targeting 25 to 30% of those units at the deepest 40% of the area median income. This is a largely Latinx population that lives in this part of town, kind of has really ingrained themselves into the culture of our Alexandria, and we think it's something that is very important to preserve. In addition to the housing affordability, preserve the culture that has become our Alexandria. As part of this, in the second smaller building that you see there, we are proposing up to 40,000 square feet of non-residential space that will be community serving. We don't have all the details worked on that yet, but first floor, hopefully a health type of provider to serve the community. And then on the second level of that building, what we're calling a nonprofit center or a nonprofit incubator, where organizations such as ours and others in town can kind of share office space, keep their costs down, and find ways to continue to serve the community. So like I said, I wanted to be brief tonight and leave time for questions, as I know you're wrapping up, everyone's wrapping up probably a very long day, but I'm always available. We kind of eat, sleep, and breathe this Alexandria housing stuff, and I am always willing to talk to folks that want to learn more about something that I think is just vital to the economic growth and the future stability of our city. So thank you so much for having me here tonight.
Thank you, John. That was very interesting. Elizabeth, how are we set for time?
We are running low on time.
Do we have time to take a question or two?
How about two? Yeah. I'll try to get everybody back on the screen.
Okay. Okay. Do we? I'm sorry. I know
there was one question I saw about how you turn low density public housing into higher density public housing.
Yes, I saw that too. That's a very good question. How do you do that? Gaynell and Janelle, how would that work?
Well, I'm like Janelle. Correct me. I would say that one of the things that we've been doing is a lot of mixed income developments and working with tax credits. And so that allows us to, basically be able to increase the number of units that were on, that site. I think Ramsey Homes is a good example of this, the one that we just redeveloped across from Charles Houston.
I see.
So, and I don't know, I think Janelle, would you add anything to that, or is that the quick summary, quick, easy answer to that? You're on mute.
You're on mute, Janelle.
I agree with Gaynell.
Okay.
And if I can just add one thing, I think as a city community, we should be very proud that back in the 1980s, City Council and ARHA basically agreed that in any time that public housing units were demolished or redeveloped, that all of the existing public housing should be replaced on a one-for-one basis. And that's something that's very unusual to have that level of commitment, and it's something that has been honored since then. So it's whenever ARHA redevelops, it has an additional challenge to make sure that all the units plus any market units go back on site, or they are relocated to another part of the city. I know their plan right now is to put everything back on site, and we certainly support that.
And just to follow up with that, someone asked, oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I did see a quick question come up in the chat about residents that may be displaced, and I just wanted to address that. So when we do redevelopments, all of our residents receive what we call a tenant protection voucher. And so if they're not, relocated to an existing unit that we have, they do, have something so that they can have a place to live. And then whenever it's ready to, the new property is opened back up, the tenants that were there first have what we call first right of refusal. So if they would like to come back, then they have the opportunity to come back to one of the new redeveloped units. And so, sometimes families choose to come back. Sometimes, for whatever reason, they, decide to stay where they've relocated to.
So I wonder, and someone else in the chat had a similar wonder, what would you have us as people of faith do? How can we make an impact on accessibility and affordability and access?
I would say, I think something that's been extraordinarily helpful is when groups come out and advocate for new projects and show up at City Council or write letters. Very often the people that are served either don't have the experience of participating in civic processes, or they are working or have childcare challenges. So it's important that the rest of us, speak up and show up to speak to support them and the project. That's one of the most important things, and it very often makes a big difference. 4 or 5 or 6 speakers, will help balance an argument or show City Council that there's a wide group of support for development.
Yeah, I would add that. Go ahead, John.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add one little, sort of piggybacking on that, because I think a lot of times what everybody is in favor of affordable housing, but then there's sometimes that thing, but just not in my backyard or not next to me, like somewhere else. So I think that that's part of it too, is just like I said, people coming out and really showing support, and so that we can get affordable housing throughout all of Alexandria and not just in segregated, communities. So good job.
I think, to piggyback off that just a little bit and to kind of put a little bow on it, a development of any sort that you're going to develop, this housing or market rate housing or anything, is usually about a 2-year process in the city of Alexandria, right? From the time you got a concept or you think that you have a piece of property that you can redevelop, it takes about 2 years just to get approvals on that project to develop it. And then another year or so to get financing, and then probably 2 to 3 years to build it. The Bloom project that I just that I talked about, our partnership with Carpenter Shelter, we started working on that project before I even started at AHDC, right? So just think about that for a second. That project, I started in 2015. They were working on the concept of that plan in 2014. We just finished it at the end of 2020. And so when a project to just kind of highlight this idea of support, by the time a project gets to City Council, many times you've had a number of community meetings, public outreach, and a number of things. And then when it gets there, to just say, well, we need to look at this more, or we need to study it more, or we need to do this, just delays that process and adds so much more cost to a project. And I would say affordable housing is a density issue. The reason in the 70s, 60s, and 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and even into the 90s, you would see that we had a lot of market rate affordable housing that has gone away. We were building high rises in the West End, like you know, a lot of housing. And when you can't develop to keep up, that what happens is the market doesn't keep up with the rate of housing. And so when people say, we'd love you to build housing, but couldn't you make it a 2-story building instead of a 7-story building, or a 3-story building instead of a 7-story building? The economics don't work. And so if you're really serious about implementing affordable housing, creating those types of opportunities, density goes hand in hand with that. And that's not always a real comfortable conversation, but it is something that needs to be supported if we want to kind of grow and provide opportunity for people across both the income spectrum and quite frankly, the racial spectrum in our city.
Thank you all so much. I actually think we could go on and on with questions, but I'm afraid our time here is almost at an end. But thank you for everything. You've given us so much to think about, and I have a feeling that we will all be continuing to work on this issue for a long time. So many thanks to all of you for your time and for your passion and for your heart for this. And for all of you who are here listening, I hope that we can all work together to do something to help further this process. So many thanks. And I wanted to let you all know that our next piece of this series will be next month on Tuesday, April 27th at 7:30 p.m. And we'll continue our exploration on the effects of systemic racism in Alexandria. We'll be focusing on education and have the honor of Dr. Hutchins, who is the superintendent of Alexandria City Public Schools, will be with us that evening. So please join us for that. And with that, I am gonna look for Martha again so she can close us in prayer.
Let us pray. Unite our voices in a call for justice, O God, so that all your people may have access to safe and affordable housing in our city. Inspire our leaders to enact policies and practices to create vibrant and diverse communities where people of every race and nation may share the wealth of their cultures with their neighbors. And remind us, O God, that we should never rest comfortably in our own homes until all your children have a safe place to call home. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Martha. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you.